Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet journey through the forgotten corners of history. Tonight, we'll uncover a lost chapter of ancient life, one whose whispers still linger through time. Whether you're curled up with a warm drink or already wrapped in blankets, thank you for letting my voice accompany you tonight. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? What time is it for you? Are you hearing this as dawn breaks? Or like me, surrounded by night's hush? If these gentle tales from ages past bring you comfort, I'd be deeply grateful if you'd subscribe. Countless more adventures await, just beyond the veil of sleep. In an era when kings ruled by divine right and peasants lived at their lord's mercy, mining stood as perhaps the most perilous occupation one could undertake. Yet for many, it was the only path to something resembling prosperity, a chance to earn coins rather than scraping survival from unyielding soil. The irony was cruel and absolute. To escape poverty, these miners descended, both literally and figuratively, into conditions that tested every fiber of their being. The medieval world was woven from hardship, but even among its many threads of suffering, miners' lives stood out in their unrelenting darkness. These were men who traded sunlight for shadows, fresh air for suffocating depths, and the simple joy of seeing the sky for the constant embrace of stone walls that could become their tombs without warning. Let us follow one such soul into the abyss, a man named Edmund, whose calloused hands knew more cold dust than soil, whose eyes had grown accustomed to torchlight rather than the sun's warmth. Edmund rises before dawn in his cramped cottage on the outskirts of a mining village in Derbyshire. The year is 1347, and the world above grapples with war, plague, and political upheaval. But Edmund's concerns are immediate, visceral. He breaks his fast with a heel of coarse bread and weak beer, the same meager meal he's eaten countless mornings. His wife, Margaret, presses a bundle into his rough hands, a scrap more bread, perhaps a sliver of cheese if luck had smiled, and always the small flask of ale that would be his sole comfort in the depths. She doesn't voice her fears. What good would it do? Every farewell kiss might be their last. Every evening reunion a minor miracle. The walk to the mine takes Edmund through the village, past the homes of fellow miners, past the small church where the priest's safety prayers seem to vanish into the morning air. Other men join this silent procession, their faces etched with the pallor of those deprived of daylight. Some cough already, a deep, rattling sound betraying lungs slowly surrendering to years of inhaling stone dust and stagnant air. The mine entrance looms ahead like the maw of some ancient beast. Wooden beams frame the opening, but these timbers offer scant reassurance. In an age when engineering relied more on intuition than science, when safety was a luxury few could afford, these supports symbolized hope more than security. The rope lowering Edmund into darkness is rough hemp, inspected by touch rather than method. One frayed strand, one weak link, could send a man plunging to his death. Yet the most telling detail of Edmund's routine comes before he steps into that black void. He removes his cap, crosses himself, and murmurs a prayer to Saint Barbara, patron saint of miners. In a world where faith and superstition intertwined like ancient roots, such rituals provided what little solace could be found. The descent begins with the groan of rope through pulleys, a sound as familiar to these men as their own breath. Down they go, leaving behind weather, seasons, birdsong, and wind, descending into a realm where temperature drops and air thickens. The shaft walls, carved from living rock, seem to press closer with every foot they sink. At the bottom, Edmund's true labor begins. By the flicker of oil lamps and tallow candles, he'll spend the next 12 hours attacking the earth with tools that seem laughably inadequate. His pickaxe, though sharp, is small and light. His hammers and chisels would have been recognizable to Roman miners a millennium prior. Progress is measured not in tons extracted, but in inches gained. A slow, relentless gnawing at seams of coal or veins of precious metal. The work is backbreaking in the purest sense. Miners often labored in spaces so cramped they couldn't stand upright, bent double or lying sideways to reach the coal face. Edmund's spine has curved permanently from years of this posture. His joints protest every movement. Young recruits enter the mine standing straight, but veterans are marked by their gait, the careful, measured steps of men whose bodies have been reshaped by their toil. Yet the physical strain pales beside the unending fear that shadows every moment underground. The earth itself feels alive with malice. Strange echoes, shifting rock, dripping water, the creak of overburdened beams might herald disaster. Each sound could signal a cave-in to bury men alive. The air Edmund breathes is a cocktail of invisible threats. Coal dust swirling in the stagnant gloom, settling in his lungs with every gasp. Over time, this dust will accumulate, turning his lungs black and stiff, each breath a struggle. The condition had no name in his time, but we know it as pneumoconiosis, the black lung disease that claimed countless miners. It's a slow death, a creeping suffocation spanning decades. Water is another foe. Rain and snowmelt seep through cracks, pooling in the lowest tunnels. Edmund often works ankle-deep in icy water, his feet perpetually numb, the damp breeding infections. Proper drainage required expertise and resources beyond medieval means. Lighting is perhaps the starkest testament to the era's limits. Edmund's world is lit by animal fat candles, their flames dancing wildly with every draft, casting monstrous shadows. These fragile lights barely illuminate his immediate workspace, leaving the tunnels beyond swallowed by a darkness so complete it feels tangible. Oil lamps, marginally better, are costly and pose their own hazards. The open flames meant to pierce the gloom could ignite pockets of explosive gas without warning. Methane, seeping from coal seams, gathers in low areas. A single spark, a candle held too close, could trigger a blast killing every man in the tunnel, perhaps collapsing the entire shaft. Edmund has witnessed such horrors. He's carried out broken bodies of men who'd been laughing hours before, comforted widows and fatherless children, knowing tomorrow might bring Margaret to her knees over his own corpse. These experiences leave scars not just on survivors, but on the community. Everyone knows someone lost underground. Everyone has heard tales of cave-ins burying men alive, of explosions leaving only charred remains. The tools of Edmund's trade tell their own story of hardship. His pickaxe, though essential, is a crude thing of iron and wood. The metal, soft by modern standards, needs constant sharpening. The wooden handle, smoothed by generations of grip, must be replaced as stone-splitting impacts weaken it. Shovels for moving debris are rough-hewn by local blacksmiths working more from tradition than metallurgical knowledge. The wheelbarrows used to transport material through the tunnels are small and flimsy, their wooden wheels prone to snapping under heavy loads or the mine's rugged terrain. These rickety contraptions symbolize the hand-to-mouth existence of mining operations, woven from whatever scraps were available, lacking standardization or systematic planning. Each miner improvises with whatever containers he can craft or afford, a testament to the industry's precariousness. The absence of proper ventilation creates an environment actively hostile to human life. The air Edmund breathes has already passed through dozens of lungs before him, tainted not just with coal dust, but with the exhalations of his fellow workers, the smoke from their candles and lamps, and invisible gases seeping from the earth itself. In summer, the stagnant air turns thick and oppressive, men fainting from heat and oxygen deprivation. In winter, the clash between surface chill and subterranean warmth makes moisture condense on tunnel walls, dripping relentlessly onto workers below. Edmund's clothes remain perpetually damp, the cold seeping into his bones during each evening's long climb back to sunlight. This oxygen-starved atmosphere spreads disease rapidly through the confined mine. A single feverish miner becomes a threat to all, yet few can afford to stay home when ill. The meager daily wage means survival for their families. Hunger or sickness becomes an impossible choice. Edmund's workday follows an ancient rhythm. He begins by inspecting his tunnel section, searching for signs of overnight shifts, loose rocks needing clearance, water requiring bailing, wooden supports begging evaluation. This morning ritual might save his life, for the restless earth transforms yesterday's solid walls into today's death traps. The actual extraction work is methodical yet exhausting. Positioning himself at the coal face, Edmund starts by undercutting the seam, driving his pickaxe horizontally at the base in a technique devastatingly effective yet catastrophically dangerous, weakening the entire face and inviting collapse. Once the undercut's complete, he drives wedges into cracks, hoping to split off manageable chunks for loading. The work demands both brute strength and surgical precision. A poorly placed strike might shatter usable coal or, worse, trigger a rockfall, crushing him instantly. Loading and transporting the extracted material adds another layer of exhaustion. Coal gets shoveled into baskets, hauled through narrow tunnels to central collection points, then transferred to larger containers for surfacing. In many mines, this transport relied entirely on human power. Men and boys carrying backbreaking loads through passages barely wider than their shoulders, bent double under weights that would stagger pack animals. The human cost of this transport system staggers imagination. Boys of 8 or 10 worked as trappers, stationed alone in darkness for 12-hour shifts, opening and closing airflow doors. These children, paid pennies for their solitary confinement underground, often developed severe psychological damage from the sensory deprivation. Women too labored in mines, not at the coal face, but as haulers dragging carts through tunnels, sometimes crawling with chains around their waists to pull impossible weights. As hours pass and Edmund continues assaulting the coal face, his body protests years of accumulated strain. His back screams from cramped positions, his hands, protected only by crude leather gloves, bleed from sharp edges, his knees, ravaged by crawling, send shooting pains through his legs. The mine's constant din, metal striking stone, groaning timber, splashing water, has damaged his hearing. Like many veterans, he endures permanent ringing and struggles with normal conversation. Dust inflames his eyes. The dim light strains his vision into relentless headaches. But the most insidious damage unfolds in Edmund's lungs. Each breath draws microscopic coal particles deep into his tissue. Over years, these invaders cause inflammation and scarring that will eventually make breathing itself agonizing. His miner's cough worsens each winter, now producing black phlegm that reveals the corruption within. The social isolation of mining work adds another layer of suffering. Spending 12 daily hours underground, Edmund loses connection with nature's rhythms that guide farmers. He doesn't witness changing seasons as agricultural workers do, missing the comforting cycle of planting and harvest that structures rural life. His world exists in eternal twilight, time measured not by the sun's arc, but by candle consumption and muscle fatigue. This disconnection from nature has profound psychological effects. Many miners develop what we now diagnose as depression, a lingering melancholy seeping into their souls like tunnel dampness into their clothes. They grow withdrawn, speaking little even to family. The constant danger and exhaustion creates men old before their time. Economic realities compound Edmund's suffering. While miners earned slightly more than farm laborers, their expenses were higher. They purchased their own tools, candles, oil, and often their underground meals. Replacing worn equipment could devour months of extra earnings, leaving mining families as poor as any peasants. Work was never guaranteed. Mines might suddenly play out, leaving dozens jobless overnight. Market fluctuations could render entire operations unprofitable. Edmund has endured these unemployment spells, surviving on charity or whatever work Margaret could find. Laundry, spinning wool, anything to avoid starvation. The company store system, though not yet fully developed in medieval times, still trapped miners in debt cycles. Buying supplies on credit from employers created obligations few could repay. Broken tools or accidents became debts forcing additional work. A system ensuring steady labor while binding workers through financial chains. Housing reflected how little their lives were valued. Edmund's cottage typified miners' homes, single-room structures with dirt floors, rough stone walls, and leaking thatch roofs. A single unglazed window with wooden shutters plunged interiors into darkness when closed. His entire family, Edmund, Margaret, and their 3 surviving children, shared this space with their few animals. Rows of identical dwellings, hastily built and barely maintained, created squalid settlements where waste accumulated, breeding disease. Wells became contaminated by mine runoff and sewage, making clean water a constant crisis. Miner mortality rates dwarfed agricultural villages, reflecting dangerous work, horrific living conditions, and environmental poisoning. Children in mining families faced particularly bleak futures. Boys understood from childhood they'd follow their fathers underground, starting work as soon as physically possible to supplement family income. Education was an unaffordable luxury when children's labor was needed both at home and eventually in the pits themselves. Girls confronted the prospect of marrying miners, condemning them to lives of perpetual worry and frequent widowhood. With miners' life expectancy significantly lower than other workers, many women would bury multiple husbands, forced to work themselves since mining families couldn't survive on single incomes. The medical care available to these communities was minimal and often counterproductive. Local physicians, if any existed, had no understanding of occupational diseases plaguing miners. Edmund's persistent cough was attributed to bad humors or miasma from underground air, with treatments like bloodletting, purges, and herbal concoctions doing nothing for his progressive lung damage. Injuries sustained in mines were treated with folk remedies, broken bones set without anatomical knowledge, often healing crooked to cause lifelong disability. Cuts constantly exposed to mine filth frequently became infected. Many miners bore scars from accidents that would have been fatal without modern medical intervention, which simply didn't exist. The psychological toll extended beyond individual miners to entire families. Children grew up knowing their fathers might never return each evening, creating constant underlying anxiety. Wives developed stress-induced illnesses manifesting as insomnia, digestive issues, and what medieval medicine called nervous disorders. Mining communities developed unique cultures of mutual support born from shared trauma. Miners watched each other's backs underground, sharing food, helping injured comrades reach safety, maintaining unspoken bonds that often meant life or death in emergencies. But this solidarity was born from desperation rather than choice, coexisting with competition for prime work areas and disputes over pay. As Edmund's shift finally ended, the ascent began, an exhausting climb after 12 hours of brutal labor. Yet this daily return to the surface also represented a rebirth, however temporary. That first lungful of clean air, that first glimpse of open sky, brought fleeting relief before the crushing realization that tomorrow demanded another descent into hell. Evening routines in Edmund's cottage were brief and utilitarian. Margaret helped wash cold dust from his face and hands with precious water hauled from the village well. The black grime seemed tattooed into his pores. No scrubbing could fully erase the evidence of his labor. His fingernails were permanently stained. His hair reeked of coal smoke. His clothes bore irreversible stains. The evening meal mirrored breakfast, a bowl of thin vegetable gruel, occasionally enhanced with bacon scraps when fortune allowed. The family ate in near silence. Edmund, too exhausted for conversation, the children trained not to disturb their father's scant rest. Before sleep, Edmund often sat outside his cottage, breathing night air while gazing at impossibly bright stars, stars made magical by contrast with his sunless existence. These stolen moments of peace were rare treasures, for dawn came cruelly early, bringing another day in the abyss. Margaret studied her husband during these quiet intervals, noting how he'd aged decades beyond his years, his labored breathing, his hunched shoulders from years of cramped labor. The bedroom, just a straw mattress shared by the entire family, offered no privacy. Edmund's worsening cough frequently interrupted sleep, though he stifled it to avoid waking others. Margaret lay awake listening to his ragged breathing, knowing each gasp might be his last. Unlike farmers governed by seasons, Edmund's work continued identically through winter gales and summer heat. The only seasonal variation came in journeying to work, treacherous winter ice making the commute deadly, summer heat making the climb back to surface especially grueling after hours in cool depths. Holiday celebrations were subdued affairs. Christmas or Easter might bring a day off, but lost wages meant leaner meals afterward. Church sermons about the nobility of labor rang hollow to men facing daily death for wages barely sustaining life. The mine owner, some distant figure who'd never set foot underground, viewed workers as disposable tools. Worker safety and occupational health were alien concepts in medieval thinking. When men died in cave-ins or from lung disease, replacements always waited, desperate souls willing to risk everything. The economic calculation was brutally simple. Human labor was cheap and replaceable. Safety measures cost money and reduced profits. Records of medieval mines were sparse, so the true death toll remains unknown. Men simply vanished, killed in accidents, dead from disease, or moved on seeking better opportunities that rarely materialized. Their stories went unrecorded, their contributions unacknowledged, their sacrifices forgotten by all but grieving families. Technological limitations meant mining would remain deadly for centuries. Steam engines to pump water and ventilate shafts were still hundreds of years away. Safety lamps preventing explosions wouldn't be invented for 4 more centuries. Understanding occupational diseases and developing protective equipment belonged to an unimaginably distant future. For Edmund and his comrades, each day underground was a gamble with death. They knew the risks, understood the dangers, but had no alternatives. Starvation was more certain and immediate than potential cave-ins or explosions. So they descended daily into Earth's dark embrace, carrying feeble lights against overwhelming darkness, clinging to hope against the crushing weight of stone and circumstance. Following Edmund through his ordeal reveals medieval mining wasn't merely dangerous, it was slow martyrdom. These men sacrificed health, longevity, and often lives not for glory or riches, but simply to feed families. They were anonymous heroes whose labor heated noble halls and forged knights' weapons, yet whose names history erased. The darkness claiming so much of their lives seems to have swallowed their stories too, leaving only fragments to reconstruct their suffering. But in recognizing their hardships, we better appreciate the true cost behind medieval civilization's modest comforts. Every lump of coal warming a lord's manor, every iron tool tilling fields, every silver coin traded in markets represented not just economic value, but human suffering on scales challenging comprehension. Edmund's story, multiplied by thousands across medieval Europe, reminds us progress often carries terrible prices, paid not by beneficiaries, but by those with no alternatives. In flickering mine candlelight, in miners' struggling breaths, in wives' worried faces as they kiss husbands goodbye each uncertain morning, we see medieval civilization's true foundations. The earth itself seemed to hunger for these men, drawing them into its depths to slowly consume them, leaving behind only the coal and/or fueling fires of a world that rarely paused to consider the human cost of its modest comforts. As dawn broke over the medieval countryside, the rhythmic clang of picks striking stone echoed from the earth's bowels. Deep beneath England and Wales' rolling hills, men like Edmund continued their endless war against unyielding rock, but the dangers they faced extended far beyond collapsing tunnels and suffocating air. The very nature of medieval mining wove a web of lethal hazards ensnaring every soul daring those dark passages. Edmund's tools were primitive by any measure. His pick, just an iron head clumsily mounted on a wooden handle, often shattered against stubborn or veins. When it broke, a frequent occurrence, he'd resort to makeshift implements cobbled from broken handles and scrap metal. The wooden beams holding up tons of earth above him were equally unreliable. Cut from whatever timber was cheapest, often green or rotting from perpetual dampness. Lighting was perhaps the most treacherous aspect. His small oil lamp's flame danced precariously in shifting air currents, This fragile glow his lifeline against absolute darkness. Yet fire underground was a double-edged sword. The very light allowing work could ignite invisible death. Miners spoke in hushed tones of fire damp, invisible vapors turning lamps into instruments of self-destruction. When ignited, explosions were swift and merciless. Men working yards away would feel the earth tremble, then silence. The terrible quiet of lives snuffed out instantly. The lucky died in the initial blast. Others were trapped behind collapsed stone, lamps extinguished, slowly suffocating as air dwindled. Survivors told of hearing trapped miners faint tapping for days, the sounds growing weaker until stopping altogether. The air itself was an enemy. In deeper tunnels, oxygen grew scarce, poisoned by accumulating gases. Carbon monoxide, invisible, odorless, crept through workings like a silent assassin. Miners grew sluggish, movements clumsy, speech slurred before collapsing. Those recognizing the signs would drag comrades towards surface air, often too late. Black damp, oxygen-depleted air, killed differently. No flames could burn where it pooled, no lungs could draw breath. Miners lowered lamps ahead like canaries. When flames guttered out, they'd reach the boundary between life and death. Water was another relentless foe. Groundwater seeped through cracks, creating icy pools making footing treacherous. In deeper mines, sudden floods could trap workers. Primitive drainage systems, hand-dug channels and bucket brigades, being hopelessly inadequate against rising water tables. Edmund often worked knee-deep in frigid water, his feet developing festering sores from perpetual dampness. The extraction process itself was brutally inefficient. After chipping or from rock faces, miners loaded baskets to be hauled through winding tunnels. Backbreaking labor typically done by younger miners or pack animals. Heavy loads made quick movement impossible when disaster struck. Many were crushed beneath collapsing tunnels, their bodies becoming part of the mines they'd emptied. Above ground, or processing was scarcely safer. Primitive smelting furnaces belched toxic smoke, clouds of lead and mercury vapor poisoning entire communities. Furnace workers lived abbreviated lives, their bodies succumbing to heavy metal poisoning manifesting in tremors, madness, and agonizing deaths. The economic structure was designed to maximize profit from suffering. Miners were paid by output, the piece rate system, incentivizing dangerous shortcuts. Safety measures cost time and money. Luxuries mine owners wouldn't afford when laborers were easily replaced. This created a vicious cycle where the poorest took greatest risks for meager wages. Company stores deepened the exploitation. Miners bought supplies on credit at inflated prices, their wages garnished to pay debts, trapping generations in bondage. A broken tool could mean months of additional labor to repay. Housing, crude barracks or tiny cottages, was deliberately kept squalid to maintain control. Eviction awaited anyone complaining about conditions. The environmental devastation was catastrophic. Forests were stripped bare for timber and furnace fuel. Rivers ran red with mining waste, killing fish and contaminating water for miles. The landscape around active mines resembled battlefields, barren wastelands where humanity waged war against nature itself. Yet within these horrors, miners forged extraordinary solidarity. They developed warning systems for dangerous gases, shared food during shortages, and risked their lives rescuing trapped comrades. This brotherhood, born of shared desperation, created bonds stronger than blood. Their legacy endures not in the metals they extracted, but in their quiet heroism, facing certain suffering daily to feed families, enduring the unendurable with dignity that shames our modern complaints. As we drift toward sleep in our comfortable world, let us remember Edmund and thousands like him, men who descended into darkness so others might walk in light. The psychological toll of mining carved deeper scars than any physical wound. In the flickering lamplight of 14th century Welsh iron mines, Garrett paused to catch his breath, his lungs burning from the acrid smoke perpetually filling the narrow tunnels. The simple act of breathing, something surface dwellers took for granted, had become a luxury many of his comrades could no longer afford. The underground world of medieval mining was a realm where death lurked in every shadow, manifesting in forms both sudden and agonizingly slow. Cave-ins struck without warning, triggered by primitive wooden supports groaning under unimaginable pressures. These crude timber frameworks, hastily erected with whatever materials could be scavenged, offered little more than false comfort to men working beneath unstable ceilings of rock and earth. Explosions transformed mines into underground infernos in seconds. Miners working by open flames had no concept of the invisible methane and other combustible gases seeping from the surrounding stone. A single spark, whether from a pickaxe striking rock or a carelessly placed lamp, could ignite devastation, flames racing through tunnels faster than any man could run. Those who survived initial blasts often faced worse fates, trapped behind walls of fire and smoke, their screams echoing through the darkness until consciousness faded. The air miners breathed was poison incarnate. In coal mine depths, toxic fumes accumulated in death pockets capable of killing a man within minutes. Hydrogen sulfide, carbon monoxide, and other odorless killers claimed lives without warning. Some experienced miners developed crude detection methods, lowering candles into suspect areas or watching for telltale changes in flame behavior. But these techniques remained dangerously unreliable. Many simply held their breath and prayed when venturing into unknown sections. Water, life's sustainer, became another executioner underground. Medieval drainage systems consisted of laughably inadequate bucket chains and hand-operated pumps, leaving miners at the mercy of flooding. Edmund remembered the horrific winter when his brother's tin mine was breached by an underground spring. The water rose with terrifying speed, trapping dozens in the deepest shafts. By the time rescuers reached them weeks later, the bloated corpses showed what it meant to drown in absolute darkness. The tools available would shame modern craftsmen. Iron picks and wooden shovels required constant repair, their soft metal edges blunting against unforgiving stone. Wheelbarrows with fragile wooden wheels collapsed under heavy loads, forcing miners to carry or in baskets strapped to their backs through tunnels barely wider than their shoulders. Every piece of equipment, from the leather bags hauling coal to the hemp ropes lowering men into shafts, was patched together from whatever scraps could be found. Lighting was both essential and deadly. Tallow candles and crude oil lamps provided faint, flickering illumination, their open flames posing constant explosion risks. Many miners worked in near-total darkness to conserve fuel, navigating by touch along walls that might suddenly give way. The dim, uneven light created depth illusions that led to fatal missteps near vertical shafts. Physical deterioration was inevitable. Men developed permanent spinal curves from years of stooping in low tunnels. Their hands became masses of scars, some from tools, others from rock shards embedded in flesh during explosions. The lucky ones lost fingers cleanly. Others died from infections when crude amputations went wrong. But the lungs suffered most. Coal dust accumulated with each breath, gradually transforming living tissue into stiff, blackened masses. What medieval physicians called miner's curse, we now know as pneumoconiosis, a slow suffocation taking decades to complete. Miners like Garrett woke nightly coughing up black phlegm, their ribs straining for air their scarred lungs could no longer hold. The economic system compounded these sufferings. Miners were typically indentured servants bound to mine owners through debts that magically never decreased. Company stores sold substandard tools at exorbitant prices while paying miners in worthless scrip. A man could work years without ever seeing real coin, his family's survival depending entirely on the owner's whims. Medical care was medieval in the worst sense. Broken bones healed crooked without proper setting, leaving men crippled. Burns from mine fires often became gangrenous, requiring amateurish amputations with dirty sauce. The few physicians who ventured into mining districts were often charlatans peddling mercury-laden cures more dangerous than the diseases. Children suffered most terribly. Boys as young as 6 worked as trappers, sitting alone in pitch darkness for 12-hour shifts. opening ventilation doors when carts passed. These children developed rickets from vitamin deficiency and permanent psychological damage from isolation. Many went mad before reaching adulthood. Women faced different horrors. While rarely working underground, they sorted coal at surface pits while raising families in squalid company housing. When husbands died, as most eventually did, widows were evicted unless they could pay debts, often forcing them into prostitution to survive. The environmental damage was generational. Forests were clear-cut for mined timbers, leaving barren landscapes. Rivers ran thick with mining waste, poisoning downstream villages. The very air around mining camps grew thick with particulate matter, ensuring even those who never descended developed respiratory ailments. Yet within this hellscape, miners preserved shreds of humanity. They developed warning songs to signal danger, shared meager food during shortages, and risked their lives to rescue trapped comrades. Their folk tales spoke of Earth's spirits and guardian saints, mythologies helping them cope with unbearable realities. When Garrett finally succumbed to black lung at 38, his widow carved a simple cross from mined timber. It joined dozens others in the makeshift cemetery, each marking a life given so others might have iron for plows, silver for coins, coal for warmth. No lords attended these funerals, no chroniclers recorded their sacrifices. But in their suffering, these forgotten miners laid foundations for worker rights we now take for granted. The mining settlements clinging to medieval hillsides were worlds unto themselves, isolated pockets of suffering where the rhythms of normal life held no meaning. These weren't the quaint villages of storybooks, but soot-choked clusters of hovels built around gaping mine entrances like supplicants kneeling before some ravenous deity. The air hung heavy with coal dust, settling on every surface like a perpetual black snowfall that never melted. Children grew up breathing this tainted air, their lungs darkening before they could form complete sentences. Edmund's village typified these mining communities. Rows of cramped stone cottages lined muddy streets, their walls stained black by the ever-present coal dust. Even on clear days, a hazy shroud lingered over the settlement, the industrial breath of the mine exhaling death slowly upon its workers. Children played in streets permanently stained black, their games often interrupted by the ominous creaking of mine structures or the rumble of work carts. A rigid social hierarchy governed these settlements. At the top stood the mine owners, wealthy merchants or minor nobles who purchased mineral rights from the crown. These men rarely visited the actual mines, preferring to manage operations from comfortable manor houses safely distant from the squalor. Beneath them were the overseers, hardened men who'd clawed their way up from the ranks through brutality and cunning. Their job was simple: maximize production while minimizing costs, regardless of human consequences. The miners themselves occupied the lowest rung, divided into specialized roles that mirrored their suffering. Hewers were the elite, skilled laborers who actually cut coal or from rock faces. This demanded both strength and technique, as a poorly placed pick stroke could collapse a tunnel or waste valuable material. They worked in spaces so cramped they often had to lie sideways, muscles screaming as they chipped away at unyielding stone for hours. Behind them came the haulers, typically younger men or boys, who loaded extracted materials into baskets or crude carts for transport. Though less skilled, their work was equally dangerous, navigating treacherous tunnels while bent double under heavy loads. Many developed permanent spinal deformities from years of unnatural postures. At the very bottom were the trappers, children as young as 8 who sat alone in pitch darkness for 12-hour shifts, operating wooden doors that controlled airflow. These children, paid pennies for their isolation, often developed severe psychological damage from the sensory deprivation and constant fear. Working conditions defied modern comprehension. Tunnels barely wider than a man's shoulders snaked through the earth, following or veins like blood vessels. Ceilings, supported by whatever timber was cheapest, groaned under millions of tons of rock. Water seeped constantly, creating icy pools that made every step treacherous. Lighting came from flickering candles or oil lamps. their feeble glow creating monstrous shadows that played tricks on exhausted minds. The extraction process was brutally inefficient. Miners attacked rock faces with hand tools recognizable to Roman ancestors. When encountering particularly stubborn stone, they'd build fires against the face to heat it, then douse it with water to induce cracking, a technique that filled tunnels with smoke and steam. Progress was measured in inches per day, each fragment of or won through tremendous effort. Transporting materials was another Herculean task. Heavy wooden buckets had to be dragged through narrow passages up steep inclines, often through flooded sections. Haulers worked in teams, their bodies bent double under loads that would challenge modern machinery. Many died from falls or crushing injuries when ropes snapped or supports failed. Above ground, where processing was scarcely safer, primitive smelting furnaces belched toxic smoke, lead, mercury, and sulfur fumes poisoning entire communities. Workers tending these furnaces developed the miner's shake, permanent tremors from heavy metal poisoning, before eventually succumbing to madness or organ failure. The economic exploitation was systematic and ruthless. Most miners were bound to their lords through feudal obligations, unable to seek better conditions elsewhere. They were paid in company scrip only redeemable at inflated company stores. Tools and safety equipment were rented at exorbitant rates rather than provided. Even the wooden supports holding up tunnels were charged against their wages, a perverse system where workers paid for their own meager protections. Housing was deliberately squalid, cramped, poorly built structures housing multiple families in conditions unfit for livestock. Located nearest the mine entrances, these dwellings sat under perpetual clouds of dust and smoke. The air inside was thick with particulates, ensuring even those who never descended suffered respiratory damage. Diets were woefully inadequate for the physical demands. Miners subsisted on coarse bread, thin gruel, and occasional scraps of preserved meat. Fresh vegetables were rare luxuries, leading to widespread malnutrition that compounded other health issues. Children showed signs of rickets and other deficiency diseases, their growth stunted by the toxic environment. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Injuries were treated with folk remedies, herb poultices or prayers being common cures for broken bones or gashes. Serious conditions like black lung were attributed to bad air or divine displeasure rather than occupational hazards. Miners simply worked until they collapsed, their broken bodies discarded when no longer productive. The psychological toll was devastating. Constant danger, claustrophobic conditions, and grinding poverty created pervasive hopelessness. Many turned to alcohol, their only escape from relentless misery, though it worsened domestic violence and economic distress. Religious faith offered some comfort, but church teachings emphasizing acceptance of suffering only reinforced the oppressive status quo. Yet within this darkness, miners forged remarkable solidarity. They developed warning systems for dangerous gases, shared food during shortages, and risked their lives to rescue trapped comrades. These acts of mutual aid, born from shared desperation, created bonds stronger than feudal obligations. Their folk songs and stories, passed through generations, preserved both their suffering and their stubborn resilience. As night fell over the mining settlement, exhausted workers gathered in whatever taverns their meager wages could afford. Here, for a few precious hours, they found respite in ale and camaraderie, the only comforts in lives otherwise defined by unending toil and premature death. The psychological scars ran deeper than any physical wound could penetrate. In the perpetual twilight of medieval mines, men developed a unique form of madness, a creeping dread that seeped into their bones like the dampness from tunnel walls. Edmund had seen strong men reduced to trembling wrecks after particularly close calls with cave-ins, their hands shaking so violently they couldn't hold a pickaxe. Others became obsessed with omens, seeing portents in the way candle flames flickered or interpreting the creak of timber supports as voices from the earth itself. This underground psychosis manifested in strange ways. Some miners claimed to hear whispers in unworked sections of tunnel, murmurs that called their names when no one else was present. Others swore they saw shadowy figures moving just beyond the circle of lamplight, vanishing when approached. The more superstitious spoke of knockers, mischievous spirits who lived in the rock and caused accidents when displeased. These beliefs weren't mere folklore. They were coping mechanisms for minds strained beyond endurance. The isolation bred peculiar behaviors. Men who spent 12 hours daily in near total silence developed rituals to maintain sanity. Some arranged their tools in precise patterns before starting work. Others sang the same songs every shift, marking time through familiar verses. A few carried talismans, a child's milk tooth sewn into clothing, a lock of sweetheart's hair wrapped in leather. Physical connections to the world above ground that grew more distant with each passing year. Women in mining communities suffered their own psychological torment. The constant uncertainty, would their men return tonight, created a perpetual state of low-grade panic. Margaret could tell the severity of mine accidents by the ringing of the warning bell. A single chime meant a minor injury. 3 signaled serious danger. The relentless clanging that didn't stop meant bodies were being recovered. She developed an involuntary flinch at loud noises. Her body, remembering before her mind could process what the sounds might portend. Children absorbed this anxiety like sponges. Mining families didn't need to explicitly tell their sons about the dangers. The way mothers clutched fathers a second longer each morning. The hushed conversations cut short when children entered rooms. The empty chairs at supper tables told the story plainly enough. Boys learned early that their future involved descending into that darkness. Just as girls understood, they'd likely bury multiple husbands. This generational trauma created communities where stoicism wasn't valued, but required for survival. The physical environment itself seemed designed to break spirits. Unlike farmers who worked under open skies, miners spent their days in a world without natural light or fresh air. The absence of sunlight disrupted sleep patterns and circadian rhythms, leaving many suffering from perpetual exhaustion. The constant dampness caused joint pain that flared with every movement. Even the sounds were oppressive: the drip of water, the groan of timber, the distant rumble of shifting earth, creating a soundtrack of impending doom. Religious faith took on desperate intensity in these conditions. Saint Barbara, the patron saint of miners, was invoked with particular fervor. Small shrines dotted the tunnels where men had died, marked with rough crosses carved into rock faces. Miners developed their own syncretic beliefs, blending Christianity with older pagan traditions about earth spirits. This fusion provided psychological armor against daily horrors. If the earth was alive and capricious, perhaps its wrath could be appeased through ritual. The economic pressures exacerbated mental strain. Knowing that an injury meant starvation for one's family, many miners worked through pain that would incapacitate others. A broken finger might go untreated for weeks because taking time off meant lost wages. The company store system ensured most were perpetually in debt, creating a gnawing sense of financial doom that never lifted. Men literally worked themselves to death because the alternative, leaving their families destitute, was unthinkable. Medical understanding of these psychological impacts was non-existent. Medieval physicians attributed such conditions to melancholia or an imbalance of humors. Treatments ranged from useless to actively harmful, bloodletting to rebalance fluids, herbal concoctions that sometimes contained toxic ingredients, or worst of all, exorcisms for those deemed possessed by demons. The miners themselves knew better. They recognized the signs of a man going tunnel mad, and would sometimes discreetly shift such individuals to less dangerous tasks, though this was rare given production demands. The coping mechanisms that developed were as varied as they were heartbreaking. Some men became compulsively meticulous about safety checks, inspecting every timber and rope with paranoid intensity. Others adopted gallows humor, joking about death in ways that would shock surface dwellers. A common toast in mining taverns was "to tomorrow, if it comes," delivered with grim smiles. This ability to laugh in the face of annihilation was perhaps their greatest psychological achievement. Artifacts from these mines tell silent stories of mental anguish. Archaeologists have found candles burned down to stubs in remote tunnel sections, evidence of men who preferred to work alone despite the dangers. Inscriptions on tunnel walls range from pious prayers to obscene graffiti, sometimes within inches of each other. At one Welsh copper mine, excavators discovered a small doll carved from mined timber, its face worn smooth from handling, likely a child trapper's sole comfort during endless shifts in darkness. The legacy of this psychological trauma extended beyond individual lifetimes. Mining communities developed distinct cultural markers, particular funeral customs, unique superstitions, and coded language about accidents. He went home, meant a miner had died underground. While the earth took him, implied no body was recoverable. These euphemisms allowed discussion of death without confronting its full horror, a linguistic buffer against despair. Modern parallels are striking. What medieval miners experienced aligns closely with what we now recognize as chronic trauma responses: hypervigilance, emotional numbing, and dissociation. Their superstitions resemble the compulsive behaviors seen in PTSD sufferers. The key difference? Modern workers have psychological support systems. Medieval miners had only their own resilience and whatever comfort they could offer each other in fleeting moments of respite. As we examine these psychological scars across centuries, we're forced to confront uncomfortable truths about human endurance. These men and women developed coping mechanisms that allowed them to face certain suffering daily, not for glory or riches, but simply to postpone starvation one more week. Their trauma was institutionalized, passed down through generations like the mines themselves. Yet within this darkness, they preserved sparks of humanity, comforting the grieving, sharing scarce resources, finding dark humor in despair. Perhaps the most profound psychological insight comes from their own sayings. One Cornish mining proverb translates roughly as, "The earth gives only what men are willing to pay in flesh." This stark acknowledgement that every lump of coal, every ounce of metal carried a human cost, may be their most enduring legacy to psychology. It reminds us that behind every industrial advancement, there are hidden prices paid in mines as well as bodies. The generational trauma of mining families wove itself into the very fabric of medieval society, like cold dust ground permanently into calloused hands. Children born into mining communities inherited more than just their father's tools. They absorbed an entire worldview shaped by darkness and danger. Young Thomas, barely 6 years old, already understood his future would be measured in candle stubs and coughing fits, his small hands destined to grow crooked around a pickaxe handle just like his father's. This cycle of inherited suffering began at startlingly young ages. Boys of 7 or 8 were sent into the mines as trapper lads, their small bodies useful for tasks requiring access to narrow passages. These children would sit alone in pitch-black tunnels for 12-hour shifts, operating wooden ventilation doors when her carts passed. The isolation was psychologically devastating. Many developed speech impediments from lack of conversation, while others suffered night terrors so severe they wet their beds well into adolescence. Girls faced different but equally cruel fates. By age 10, most were working as coal sorters above ground, their small fingers picking through extracted material while inhaling the same toxic dust that plagued underground workers. Their education consisted of learning how to identify different grades of coal, a skill that might earn the family an extra half-penny per basket, but guaranteed their own future children would repeat the cycle. The physical toll on developing bodies was catastrophic. Archaeological evidence from medieval mining villages shows stunted growth patterns. Teenage miners' skeletons often resemble those of much younger children, with bone deformities indicating severe vitamin D deficiency and constant heavy labor. Many never reached full adult height, their growth plates damaged by years of carrying excessive weights before puberty. Dental records reveal chronic malnutrition, with cavities and abscesses being nearly universal among mining children. Parenting in these communities took on a uniquely fatalistic quality. Mothers taught their sons not how to read or write. but how to recognize the whistle of falling rocks or the particular creak of overloaded timber. Fathers showed daughters how to wrap a dead miner's belongings into a bundle, a skill they'd likely need multiple times in life. There was no sugarcoating reality. Children as young as 5 understood that daddy might not come home tonight, and if he didn't, the family would need to move into the even smaller widow's cottage by month's end. The economic traps ensured this cycle continued unabated. Company stores extended credit to mining families, knowing full well the debts would never be fully repaid. When a miner died, his outstanding balance often transferred to his eldest son, a form of generational indentured servitude that kept boys underground before they could legally consent to work. Wages were structured to always remain just shy of what was needed to settle accounts, creating perpetual obligation. Education was the rarest of luxuries. Few mining villages had schools, and those that did charged fees far beyond what miners could afford. Even when education was technically available, families often couldn't spare their children's labor. A boy hauling half baskets of coal contributed more immediate value than one learning his letters. The few who somehow attained literacy often became clerks or minor officials, their escape only highlighting the hopelessness of those left behind. Marriage patterns reinforced the system's cruelty. Mining daughters typically wed miner sons, creating dynasties of underground labor. Widows frequently remarried within their dead husband's work crews, not for love, but survival. A new husband meant continued access to the company cottage and some protection from the worst abuses of the debt system. These unions were often sterile, as years of malnutrition and toxic exposure left many miners infertile by their late 20s. Religious observances took on specific mining-related adaptations. Baptisms included prayers for protection underground. Wedding vows acknowledged the high probability of early widowhood, and funerals developed coded language to avoid angering mine owners, taken by the earth, instead of crushed in a preventable collapse. Churches in mining districts often had special shrines to St. Barbara, where miners would leave miniature pickaxes carved from wood or bits of, or as votive offerings. The environmental damage created self-perpetuating cycles of poverty. As nearby forests were stripped for mine timbers and furnace fuel, families lost access to traditional food sources like berries and game. Contaminated streams couldn't support fish, removing another protein source. What little land remained arable was often too polluted for crops, forcing complete dependence on expensive company store provisions. Medical care was essentially non-existent for mining children. Broken bones from hauling heavy loads were set by whoever happened to be nearby, often healing crooked and causing lifelong pain. Trapper's lung, a childhood form of pneumoconiosis, was so common it wasn't even considered remarkable. When a 12-year-old coughed up black phlegm, it simply meant he was ready for full underground work. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the psychological adaptations. Children developed gallows humor unusual even by medieval standards, joking about cave-ins the way modern children might tease about school tests. Games often involved reenacting mining disasters, with the dead player lying motionless until St. Barbara came to resurrect them. This wasn't callousness, but a survival mechanism. If tragedy was inevitable, better to confront it through play than be shattered when it came. The few who escaped did so through sheer luck or extraordinary sacrifice. A bright boy might catch the eye of a visiting priest and be taken on as an acolyte. A pretty girl could sometimes marry into a marginally better-off farming family, though this usually required hiding her mining background. For everyone who left, hundreds remained, their family lines continuing underground until the mines played out or their bodies gave out, whichever came first. Modern analysis of parish records reveals the devastating scope of this generational trauma. In some Cornish tin mining villages, over 60% of children died before reaching adulthood, while those who survived averaged just 45 years of life, a decade shorter than contemporary agricultural workers. Family trees show multiple generations buried in quick succession, the dates clustering around known mining disasters. Yet within this unrelenting bleakness, glimmers of resistance persisted. Some families secretly taught their children to read using smuggled Bible pages. Others maintained hidden gardens in abandoned tunnels, defying company prohibitions against growing food. A few even developed elaborate schemes to fake deaths and escape debt bondage, though failure meant brutal punishment. These small acts of defiance, preserving literacy, stealing moments of beauty, risking everything for freedom, testify to the indomitable human spirit. The medieval mining dynasties left no great artworks or written histories, but their legacy lives on in the labor rights we now take for granted. Every modern safety regulation, every workers' compensation law, carries faint echoes of those generations sacrificed to darkness so we might walk in light. The environmental devastation wrought by medieval mining operations extended far beyond the immediate pits and tunnels, creating ecological wounds that would take centuries to heal. What began as small surface diggings in the 12th century had, by Edmund's time in the mid-14th century, transformed entire landscapes into grotesque mockeries of their former selves. The countryside around Edmund's village now resembled a festering scar. Where once lush forests had stood, only skeletal remains of trees marked the insatiable demand for mined timbers and furnace fuel. The scale of deforestation was staggering. A single medium-sized silver mine could consume an acre of mature woodland every fortnight just to maintain its tunnel supports. The preferred oak and beech were particularly prized for their strength, leading to the systematic stripping of these species from entire regions. With no concept of sustainable forestry, mine operators cut indiscriminately, leaving slopes bare and vulnerable to erosion. Spring rains now carried away the thin topsoil that had taken millennia to form, exposing bedrock in places where wildflowers had once bloomed. Water systems suffered equally catastrophic damage. Miners dug drainage channels that diverted streams from their natural courses, sending the water gushing into mine shafts where it mixed with mineral waste before being expelled downstream. The once clear brook near Edmund's village now ran orange with iron oxide, its surface iridescent with oil slicks from lamp fuel. Fish had long since vanished. Their floating carcasses had marked the first years of mining operations, belly up with gills clogged by silt and toxins. What few frogs or water insects remained were grotesquely deformed, their twisted limbs bearing silent witness to the heavy metals now suffusing the ecosystem. The air itself became a vector of disease. Smelting operations ran day and night, their billowing smoke clouds visible for miles. The acrid stench of burning sulfur clung to clothing and hair, permeating the thatch of cottages until even rainwater collected in barrels carried a metallic tang. In winter, when temperature inversions trapped these fumes close to the ground, smoke sickness would sweep through villages. Children and the elderly developing racking coughs that sometimes turned fatal as their lungs filled with fluid. Groundwater contamination created slow-moving disasters. As miners dug ever deeper, they inadvertently connected previously isolated aquifers, allowing toxins to spread through underground water tables. Wells that had provided clean drinking water for generations suddenly turned brackish and foul. In Edmund's village, the once sweet community well now produced water that left a blue tinge on cooking pots, a telltale sign of copper sulfate contamination. Several infants had died after their wet nurses drank from it, though no physician made the connection explicit. The biological consequences rippled through food chains. Bees avoided the acid-laden nectar of flowers growing near mine entrances, leading to declining pollination of fruit trees. What crops did grow in contaminated soil often had stunted roots and strangely colored leaves. Sheep that grazed on hillsides downwind of smelters developed wasting disease, their teeth loosening and wool falling out in patches from chronic lead poisoning. Even the wild mushrooms that had once been a reliable famine food now carried enough accumulated metals to cause violent illness. Medieval people lacked the scientific framework to understand these ecological connections, but they developed folk wisdom to cope. Mine sick became a local term for the general malaise affecting communities near extraction sites. Pregnant women avoided eating rabbits caught near the pits, having noticed too many stillbirths when they did. An old Cornish saying warned, "Where the miner's shadow falls, no wholesome thing will grow." A poetic recognition of the environmental toll, if not its precise mechanisms. The mining companies, such as they existed in this era, showed willful disregard for these consequences. When peasants complained about poisoned streams, mine owners would dismiss their concerns as superstitious nonsense. After all, educated men knew that disease came from bad air or divine punishment, not invisible minerals. Some particularly ruthless operators even claimed the discolored waters were a sign of the earth's blessings being released. The few attempts at regulation were easily circumvented. A statute requiring smelters to be built 2 bow shots from villages simply resulted in archers being paid to shoot conspicuously short distances when officials visited. For the miners themselves, this environmental degradation compounded their suffering. After breathing rock dust underground all day, they emerged to smoke-filled air. The meager plots where they tried to grow vegetables were contaminated by runoff. Even their scant leisure time was poisoned. Where once they might have fished or foraged to supplement inadequate diets, now those options were gone. The very earth seemed to turn against them, offering neither sustenance in life nor clean rest in death. Graves dug in mining districts often filled with orange-tinted water during heavy rains. Yet in this despoiled landscape, nature occasionally fought back in startling ways. Certain plants thrived in the toxic environment. Tough, stringy grasses with deep roots that sucked up metals and stored them in their blades. Shepherd's purse, a common weed, growing near Edmund's mine, contained 20 times the lead concentration of the same plant in unpolluted areas. While inedible to humans, these metal-accumulating species slowly began stabilizing the soil, their root systems preventing total erosion. Water systems showed similar tenacity. In a few places where mining had ceased decades earlier, some streams managed to self-purify, the constant flow gradually diluting toxins until mayfly nymphs and water skaters reappeared. These rare recoveries offered faint hope that the land might eventually heal, though far too slowly to benefit those currently suffering its wrath. The psychological impact of living in a ruined environment was profound but rarely articulated. Miners developed a fatalistic attitude toward the destruction. What was the point of objecting when your livelihood depended on the very practices causing the damage? Children born into these landscapes had no memory of how things used to be, accepting the stripped hills and dead streams as normal. Only the elderly could recall tasting berries from bushes now gone, or fishing in waters now lifeless, their stories sounding like fairy tales to younger generations. This environmental catastrophe wasn't limited to a few unfortunate regions. As demand for metals and coal grew, the same patterns repeated across medieval Europe. Forests fell in Wales to fuel Cornish tin smelting. German silver mines poisoned rivers flowing into Flanders. Hungarian gold operations stripped the Carpathian foothills. The scale was continental, the consequences intergenerational. Modern analysis of medieval mining sites reveals the staggering longevity of this pollution. Peat cores from English moors downwind of 14th century lead mines still show elevated metal concentrations today. Tree rings from ancient oaks near abandoned workings display stunted growth for centuries after operations ceased. The earth remembers what human records forgot. Yet from this devastation emerged the first glimmers of environmental consciousness. Some monastic orders refused to invest in mining ventures due to the unnatural violation of God's earth. A few forward-thinking physicians began correlating mine-sick symptoms with proximity to certain ores. And in Edmund's own village, an anonymous miner carved a warning into the church wall. "We take the earth's bones, and it takes our breath in return." A crude but profound recognition of the reciprocity between human exploitation and ecological consequences. These scattered insights wouldn't coalesce into true environmental protection for centuries, but they planted seeds. When we today debate balancing economic needs against ecological preservation, we walk paths first trodden by medieval miners, people who lacked our knowledge but whose lived experience taught them hard lessons about the costs of unbridled extraction. Their suffering wrote the earliest chapters in humanity's ongoing struggle to find harmony with the natural world that sustains us all. The technological limitations of medieval mining created a perfect storm of danger and inefficiency that magnified human suffering exponentially. What passed for mining technology in Edmund's time would be unrecognizable to modern engineers. A haphazard collection of rudimentary tools and dangerous improvisations that turned every workday into a gamble with death. The very equipment meant to extract wealth from the earth often became instruments of torture for those forced to wield it. Consider the windlass, the primitive winch system used to lower men and materials into the pits. A fraying hemp rope wound around a wooden drum, its fibers weakened by constant friction against rough stone edges. The brakeman controlling descent relied solely on his own strength to prevent catastrophic free fall, his calloused hands gripping a timber lever that transferred no mechanical advantage. Many miners met their end when overwound ropes snapped or brake mechanisms failed, their bodies plummeting down shafts lined with jagged outcroppings that tore flesh from bone during the terrible descent. Lighting technology was equally perilous. The tallow candles used in most mines burned unevenly, their animal fat wax dripping onto miners' hands, and their smoke blackening already filthy air. Worse still, the open flames posed constant explosion risks in methane-rich environments. Some mines experimented with crude oil lamps, but these often leaked flammable fluid that could turn a miner's slip into an inferno. The so-called safety lamps of later centuries, enclosed flames that couldn't ignite gas, were still 400 years in Edmund's future. Ventilation systems, where they existed at all, relied on bafflingly simplistic methods. Some operations used canvas sails to divert air currents, while others depended on the fire-setting technique, igniting fires at shaft bottoms to create convection currents. This latter method often backfired catastrophically, either suffocating miners when the flames consumed all available oxygen or triggering collapses when heated rock fractured unpredictably. Many mines simply accepted that certain areas would always be bad air zones, sacrificing workers' health rather than investing in proper airflow solutions. Or extraction methods bordered on self-destructive. Without understanding structural geology, miners often undermined their own tunnels by removing load-bearing strata. The room and pillar technique, leaving columns of untouched material to support ceilings, was understood only in the crudest sense, resulting in pillars too slender or spaced too far apart. Collapses were so frequent that miners developed an entire vocabulary to describe different types. Hot drops, localized ceiling failures, pillar bursts, when support columns shattered under pressure, and the dreaded whole mountain coming in, catastrophic chain reaction collapses. Dewatering efforts were exercises in futility. Some mines used endless chains of wooden buckets operated by treadmill-like devices powered by blindfolded donkeys walking in circles. Others relied on rag and chain pumps, leather strips tied to ropes that theoretically lifted water through pipes, but more often simply redistributed moisture while snapping under strain. The most advanced operations employed Archimedes screws, but these bronze spirals were prohibitively expensive and prone to clogging with debris. The lack of metallurgical knowledge compounded these dangers. Medieval smiths couldn't produce steel strong enough for durable tools, so picks and chisels were made from wrought iron that bent or shattered under stress. A miner might resharpen his pick a dozen times in a single shift as the soft metal dulled against quartz veins. The constant need to repair and replace equipment created additional hazards. Improvised fixes often failed at critical moments, sending metal shards flying like shrapnel. Transportation within mines defied all modern safety logic. Instead of rail carts, many operations used sledges made from green timber that warped under load. These were dragged through tunnels by workers crawling on hands and knees, their spines twisting at unnatural angles to pull weights that should have required draft animals. In some Welsh lead mines, children as young as 6 were harnessed like ponies to or carts, their developing bones permanently deformed by the strain. The absence of standardized measurement created constant confusion. Depth was estimated by rope lengths, or quality judged by eye, tunnel dimensions determined by whatever space remained after supports were installed. This lack of precision led to horrific miscalculations. Veins pursued into dangerously unstable ground, shafts sunk too close to underground rivers, support timbers cut too short and wedged into place with fatal compromises. Medical technology for treating injuries was medieval in the most literal sense. A broken leg might be set, with wooden splints tied by leather straps that cut off circulation. Severe burns were treated with honey poultices that attracted infection. The few barber surgeons who ventured into mining districts carried tools better suited to butchering livestock than healing humans. Bone saws with rusted teeth, probes that introduced more contamination than they removed. Perhaps most shockingly, the era lacked even basic safety protocols. There were no emergency exits, no rescue teams, no warning systems beyond shouted alerts that rarely carried far enough. When accidents occurred, as they did daily, survivors relied on sheer luck and whatever help nearby miners could provide while risking their own lives. The concept of a safety inspector wouldn't emerge for centuries, leaving workers to develop their own folk methods for assessing danger. Licking rocks to detect iron sulfide, watching candle flames for gas warnings, tapping ceilings with hammers, and interpreting the echoes. These technological shortcomings weren't merely inconvenient, they were murderously inefficient. Modern analysis suggests medieval miners expended up to 80% of their energy overcoming technological limitations rather than actually extracting materials. A typical worker might spend 4 hours of each shift repairing tools, bailing water, or shoring up collapses, labor that produced but was essential to continued operation. The psychological toll of working with such inadequate tools is hard to overstate. Miners knew their equipment was barely functional, that every piece might fail catastrophically at any moment. This constant low-grade anxiety wore down resilience, making men jump at normal sounds and see threats in every shadow. The term tunnel madness described not just the isolation, but the specific psychosis induced by relying on tools that seemed actively trying to kill you. Yet within these constraints, miners developed remarkable ingenuity. They learned to read rock faces like books, discerning or quality from subtle color variations. They repurposed broken tools, turning shattered pick heads into makeshift chisels, weaving unraveled ropes into support nets. Some even devised early warning systems using strategically placed feathers that twitched when air currents changed, a primitive gas detection method. This desperate creativity highlights the central tragedy of medieval mining technology, the staggering waste of human potential. The same men who devised ingenious solutions to impossible problems were systematically prevented from developing their ideas further by the crushing weight of exploitation and poverty. Had even a fraction of their collective intelligence been channeled into proper engineering rather than survival improvisation, mining technology might have advanced centuries faster. The legacy of these technological failures lingers in modern safety standards. Every reinforced mine shaft, every gas detector, every emergency oxygen tank carries silent homage to those who died for lack of such basics. When we watch holographic schematics of modern mining operations, we're seeing the end product of countless hard lessons written in medieval miners' blood. Lessons about proper ventilation, structural integrity, and the true cost of valuing production over people. The economic machinery of medieval mining operated with ruthless efficiency, transforming human lives into expendable inputs within a vast system of exploitation. Every link in this chain, from the distant nobles who owned mineral rights to the starving children sorting or above ground, was carefully calibrated to extract maximum value from each worker before discarding them like spent tools. Edmund's village existed as a microcosm of this system, its every structure and custom designed to perpetuate an endless cycle of debt and dependency. At the top of this predatory pyramid sat the mineral lords, often absentee aristocrats who viewed mines as little more than self-replenishing coffers. These men held royal charters granting exclusive rights to all underground wealth within their domains, a legal fiction that transformed the earth itself into private property. Through layers of middlemen and stewards, they enforced a regime where miners were technically free laborers, but in reality bound by webs of obligation impossible to escape. The contracting system added another layer of exploitation. Mine operators, often wealthy burghers, leased mineral rights from lords, then subcontracted actual work to labor bosses. These middlemen paid miners by the basket load of ore, setting rates just high enough to prevent outright starvation, but too low to accumulate savings. A typical contract deducted costs for tools, candles, and even the rope that lowered men into pits, expenses that always seemed to multiply whenever wages threatened to rise. Company stores completed the trap. Since most mines were in remote locations, workers had no alternative but to purchase food and supplies from mine-owned establishments. Prices were inflated 30 to 50% above market rates, while quality was deliberately poor: moldy flour, rancid bacon, and tools that broke under minimal stress. Workers paid in company scrip rather than real coin, ensuring they couldn't take their business elsewhere. Account books were routinely falsified to show perpetual debt, with illiterate miners having no way to verify charges. This system created mathematically perfect servitude. Consider Edmund's typical month. After deductions for equipment rental and mandatory purchases, his net earnings might total 2 shillings, enough to buy 8 loaves of decent bread on the open market. But since he was paid in company scrip redeemable only at the mine store, where bread cost triple, his actual purchasing power shrank to 3 loaves of weevil-infested ration bread. Any illness or injury reducing his output plunged him further into debt that became inheritable upon death. Women and children were systematically targeted to deepen this bondage. Wives of miners were required to work unpaid as sorters, a policy justified as offsetting housing costs. Their labor doubled the mine's productivity while receiving no direct compensation. Children as young as 5 were pressed into service as runners, carrying messages between shafts. By the time boys were strong enough to work underground, they already owed years of training fees deducted from future wages. The physical infrastructure reinforced this economic prison. Company housing was deliberately flimsy. Crude stone huts with dirt floors and leaky thatch roofs, spaced precisely far enough apart to prevent private vegetable gardens. Without access to arable land or grazing rights, families became utterly dependent on company stores for survival. Water sources were strategically controlled. The single clean well required payment per bucket during droughts, while free runoff from mine drainage caused chronic dysentery. Enforcement relied on psychological terror as much as physical coercion. Miners who questioned accounts were told the entire family would lose housing. Those whispering about organizing might find their tools mysteriously damaged before a critical inspection. The few who attempted escape were hunted down by bounty hunters contracted through the manorial courts, their subsequent public punishments serving as warnings. Religious institutions were complicit in maintaining this system. Local priests, often funded by mine owners, preached sermons framing poverty as divine will and obedience as sacred duty. The confessional became an intelligence-gathering tool. A miner complaining about conditions might find himself assigned to the most dangerous tunnels. Even burial rites were monetized. Families had to pay extra to enter loved ones facing east toward Jerusalem, with the poor consigned to unconsecrated ground. The seasonal nature of mining work created additional vulnerabilities. When winter floods or summer droughts temporarily halted operations, workers weren't paid but still owed rent and store debts. These gaps forced families to take high-interest loans from the same operators who employed them, creating a spiral where spring's wages went entirely to paying winter's survival debts. Market fluctuations amplified the cruelty. When silver prices dropped suddenly in 1345 due to French mine discoveries, Cornish operators slashed wages overnight while keeping store prices fixed. Dozens of families starved that winter while stockpiles grew. the owners waiting for prices to rebound before resuming full production. Similar manipulations occurred whenever new metal sources were found or wars disrupted trade routes. Resistance was extraordinarily difficult, but not unknown. The 1329 Tin Workers' Revolt in Devon saw miners torch a company store after being sold flour mixed with ground slate. Their punishment, hanging the leaders and billing the survivors for the building's reconstruction, became standard practice across Europe. More subtle forms of rebellion included deliberate slowdowns, misplacing tools, and smuggling out high-grade or in body cavities to sell independently. The accounting techniques developed to maintain this system were remarkably sophisticated for the era. Mine stewards used double-entry bookkeeping, a novelty in 14th century Europe, to track each worker's debits and credits. Complex calculations determined exactly how much a miner could be squeezed before becoming useless. If a worker's productivity dropped below the cost of replacing him, he was evicted from company housing regardless of debts owed. This economic model's success is evident in its longevity and geographic spread. Nearly identical systems operated from Hungarian gold mines to Swedish iron pits, proving adaptable across cultures and mineral types. The only variables were how quickly workers were used up. Cornish tin miners averaged 12 years underground before being discarded, while German silver miners rarely lasted 8. Modern parallels are uncomfortably apparent. The medieval mining economy prefigured contemporary gig work, company towns, and predatory lending, all systems where theoretical freedom masks actual bondage. When we today debate living wages or workplace safety, we're continuing struggles first fought by Edmund and his comrades centuries ago. Their suffering established an uncomfortable truth that technological progress often outpaces moral advancement, and that unchecked capitalism will happily monetize human desperation. Yet from this darkness emerged the first glimmers of labor consciousness. The very accounting meant to control miners inadvertently taught them mathematics and record-keeping. The company store's price gouging inspired some communities to establish hidden barter networks, and the brutal punishments meted out to rebels like the tin workers forged solidarity across villages, a solidarity that would eventually fuel the labor movements of later centuries. The medieval mining economy's most enduring legacy may be its cautionary tale about the human cost of unfettered extraction, not just of minerals, but of human dignity. When we walk past abandoned company towns or read about modern mining disasters, we're witnessing the latest iterations of a system perfected in Edmund's time, one that still measures human lives in baskets of or in profit margins. The medical horrors of medieval mining constituted a slow-motion massacre, with each year underground stealing another piece of a man's health until nothing remained but a broken husk. What passed for occupational medicine in Edmund's time was little more than a collection of folk remedies and superstitions that often hastened death rather than preventing it. The miners' bodies became living maps of their suffering, blackened lungs, twisted spines, and festering wounds marking each stage of their descent into permanent disability. Respiratory diseases were the mining community's silent reapers. The condition miners called black spit, now recognized as pneumoconiosis, began innocuously, a morning cough producing flecks of sooty phlegm. Over years, the cough deepened into violent spasms that left men gasping on their knees, their ribs aching from the effort. In advanced stages, victims' lips turned blue from oxygen deprivation as their lungs transformed into stiff, coal-encrusted sacs incapable of expansion. The final months were particularly cruel, miners essentially drowning in air, their chests heaving futilely while their families watched helplessly. Bone and joint deterioration created another spectrum of agony. The constant crouching in low tunnels deformed spines into permanent question marks, a condition known as miner's hump. Knees swollen from years of crawling developed bone spurs that grated with every movement. Archaeologists examining medieval miner skeletons find unmistakable markers, vertebrae fused at unnatural angles, hip sockets deformed by abnormal loads, and arthritic growths resembling cauliflower florets on every joint surface. Hand injuries were so universal they became badges of honor. Fingers crushed by falling rocks often healed crooked or were amputated with dirty chisels. Palm calluses hardened into horn-like protrusions from gripping tools. The most veteran miners could be identified by their pitcher's grip, hands permanently frozen in a claw-like position from decades of wielding picks. These deformities made simple acts like holding a spoon or embracing children increasingly difficult as the years passed. Waterborne illnesses plagued every mining community. Stagnant pools and tunnels bred parasites that entered through miners' cracked skin or were ingested when thirst drove men to drink contaminated water. Mine fever, likely leptospirosis, caused violent chills, jaundice, and sometimes kidney failure. Those who survived often suffered permanent liver damage that turned their eyes and skin yellowish, a telltale marker that scared away potential employers above ground. The psychological toll manifested in ways medieval medicine couldn't comprehend. Tunnel visions haunted miners, waking dreams where solid rock walls seemed to breathe or ripple. Many developed compulsive behaviors like counting their steps or touching every third support beam, rituals believed to ward off cave-ins. Sleep deprivation from chronic pain led to hallucinations where men saw phantom lanterns in dark tunnels or heard voices calling from solid rock faces. Medical treatment often worsened conditions. Standard practice for respiratory distress was bloodletting, depriving already oxygen-starved bodies of vital hemoglobin. Broken bones were set with such force that splinters often pierced skin, inviting infections. Herbal poultices applied to wounds frequently introduced tetanus or gangrene. The rare licensed physician who visited mining camps carried medications containing mercury or lead, toxins that accumulated in miners' already poisoned systems. Child miners suffered distinct horrors. Boys working as trappers developed dark blindness from years in unlit tunnels. Their pupils permanently dilated to the point where daylight caused excruciating pain. Spinal deformities in children were particularly grotesque, their still-growing skeletons warping into hunched configurations that left them shorter than their peasant counterparts. Dental remains show severe enamel defects from malnutrition combined with constant exposure to acidic mine waters. Women attached to mining camps faced their own health crises. Ore sorting exposed them to heavy metal dust that caused miscarriages and stillbirths. Those working in smelting operations inhaled enough lead vapor to develop smelter shakes, violent tremors that made holding utensils impossible. Prostitutes servicing miners, often widows with no other income, contracted and spread diseases at alarming rates, their bodies becoming vectors for epidemics that ravaged entire settlements. The elderly were virtually non-existent in these communities. Those who somehow survived into their 50s were so broken they could barely walk, their lungs functioning at less than half capacity, their joints swollen with pus-filled abscesses. Many were abandoned during seasonal migrations when mines played out, left to die in abandoned shacks where their skeletons wouldn't be found for centuries. Medical archaeology reveals the full horror. Soil analyses from mining settlement latrines contain shocking concentrations of heavy metals, levels that would trigger EPA Superfund designations today. Hair samples from preserved corpses show alternating bands of lead and mercury exposure corresponding to payday binges at company taverns where drinks were deliberately adulterated with these metals to increase thirst. Perhaps most disturbing are the healing artifacts found in mining ruins. Crude prosthetic hands carved from mine timber, their leather straps still stained with sweat. Herbal bundles containing hallucinogenic mushrooms likely used to dull pain. Most haunting of all, small lead figurines of saints found clutched in skeletal hands, their surfaces worn smooth from desperate rubbing during agonized final breaths. The miner's own folk medicine offered marginally more relief than learned practice. Grass drops, fermented plant extracts, provided some analgesic effect for joint pain. Steam inhalations with mint or eucalyptus temporarily eased breathing. But their most effective remedies were psychological, elaborate healing rituals where senior miners would transfer their strength to younger sufferers through symbolic gestures, creating placebo effects powerful enough to let men work through otherwise debilitating pain. This medical catastrophe's legacy persists in modern occupational health paradigms. The Black Lung Benefits programs, workplace safety standards, and disability protections we take for granted today are direct responses to the suffering of men like Edmund. When radiologists now compare coal miners' chest X-rays to medieval skeletal remains, the patterns of damage are eerily identical, proof that some industrial harms transcend centuries of technological progress. Yet for all its horrors, medieval mining medicine yielded one paradoxical blessing: the earliest known descriptions of occupational diseases. A 13th century German physician's account of stone lung in miners predates formal recognition of pneumoconiosis by 600 years. These scattered clinical observations, buried in forgotten manuscripts, would eventually help establish the principle that employers bear responsibility for workplace health, a radical notion that took centuries to gain acceptance. The miners' bodily suffering also left an unexpected artistic legacy. Their deformed hands appear in period artwork, the claw-like grips of St. Barbara's devotees in church frescoes being unmistakably modeled on real miners' injuries. Even the famous Dance of Death woodcuts feature skeletal miners with characteristic spinal curves, a macabre tribute to how thoroughly industrial hazards shaped medieval conceptions of mortality. As we examine CT scans of modern miners still battling black lung today, we're witnessing the latest chapter in an ancient struggle. The silica dust may be finer, the safety equipment more advanced, but the fundamental equation remains unchanged: human tissue versus mineral wealth, with the former always paying the ultimate price. Medieval miners' bodies were the first casualties in this endless war, their suffering setting precedents that still echo through workers' compensation courts and occupational health clinics worldwide. The spiritual world of medieval miners existed in a twilight realm between official church doctrine and older, earthbound beliefs, a syncretic faith forged in darkness to explain the unexplainable suffering they endured daily. Far from the soaring cathedrals and illuminated manuscripts of mainstream Christianity, these subterranean worshippers developed rituals and superstitions that blended saintly veneration with primal fears of the earth's capricious power. St. Barbara stood as the most prominent figure in this underground pantheon. According to legend, this 3rd century martyr had been imprisoned in a tower by her pagan father, a story miners reinterpreted as symbolic of their own entrapment underground. They carved her image into tunnel walls at regular intervals, these crude reliefs serving both as devotional objects and distance markers. Before each descent, Edmund would press his forehead against the mine entrance's Barbara statue, whispering the miner's prayer: "As you endured the tower, help us bear the pit." But older deities lurked beneath this Christian veneer. The knockers of Cornish tin mines, mischievous spirits believed to inhabit the deepest tunnels, were likely holdovers from pre-Christian Celtic beliefs. Miners would leave offerings of tallow cakes in remote passages, hoping to appease these entities who could either cause cave-ins or reveal rich or veins through their tapping. Similar traditions existed across Europe. German miners feared the Bergman line, little miners, while Hungarian gold diggers spoke of the Sarkany, dragon whose breath caused deadly gas pockets. The mine itself became a sacred space requiring careful protocols. Certain tunnels were considered crossing places, where the veil between worlds grew thin. Miners reported hearing ghostly picked sounds in played-out sections where no living soul worked. New shafts were christened, with beer libations poured into the first drill holes, a practice condemned by priests but stubbornly preserved. Even mundane actions followed ritual. Tools were never laid crosswise, an omen of impending death, and whistling underground was forbidden lest it summon malevolent forces. Death rituals took on particular significance. When a miner perished underground, his comrades would wrap the body in his cloak and place a candle at his head and feet, not just for Christian symbolism, but because many believed the flame would guide his spirit through the earth's labyrinth. The dead man's tools were often buried with him, both to prevent bad luck and because many thought he'd need them in the afterlife. Some Welsh mines developed the eerie tradition of last shift, leaving a dead miner's lamp burning at his usual workplace for 3 days after his passing. The church's relationship with mining communities remained deeply ambivalent. On one hand, priests condemned the pagan elements of miners' beliefs. On the other, they recognized mining as essential to church wealth. Many monasteries owned profitable mines. This hypocrisy manifested in peculiar compromises. Bishops might denounce knocker worship while blessing new mine openings, or preach against superstitions while selling St. Barbara metals guaranteed to prevent cave-ins. Miners developed their own underground interpretations of Scripture. The Book of Job held particular resonance, with its themes of undeserved suffering and divine testing. Passages about those who dig through mountains were read at clandestine gatherings, often with added verses composed by minor poets. The Psalms took on new meanings underground. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord, Psalm 130, became a literal rather than metaphorical plea. The liturgical calendar adapted to mining rhythms. While surface communities celebrated feast days tied to agricultural cycles, miners venerated dates relevant to their work. St. Barbara's Day, December 4th, became their primary festival, while St. Anne's Day, July 26th, marked the start of the summer mining season. Even Christmas took on subterranean symbolism, the light in darkness motif resonating powerfully with men who spent winters working before dawn and after dusk. Religious artifacts reflected this unique spirituality. Mining churches displayed peculiar votive offerings, tiny lead pickaxes, miniature or carts, and candles molded to resemble injured limbs. Some Welsh chapels housed miracle lamps, said to burn eternally without oil, their wicks allegedly woven from the hair of dead miners. Pilgrimage sites near major mines developed specialties. One Austrian shrine claimed its holy earth could protect against cave-ins if ingested daily. The afterlife beliefs of miners blended Christian eschatology with older concepts of underground realms. Many believed righteous miners would spend eternity in celestial mines where veins never played out and tools never broke. Damned souls were condemned to fire levels, eternal versions of the deepest, hottest mine sections where collapses were constant. Some Cornish miners spoke of the Old Man's Shaft, a mythical tunnel leading directly to purgatory that only the purest could find. This rich spiritual world served crucial psychological functions. By attributing disasters to supernatural causes rather than human negligence, miners could maintain some sense of control. If cave-ins resulted from angered spirits rather than poor engineering, then proper rituals might prevent them. The ever-present saints and spirits also provided companionship in isolation. Many miners reported feeling watched over during solitary night shifts. Modern archaeology continues uncovering traces of this underground faith. Excavated mines reveal devotional niches carved into support timbers, their surfaces blackened by centuries of candle smoke. At one Derbyshire lead mine, researchers found a 14th century wooden figurine of St. Barbara hidden inside a tunnel wall, likely placed there secretly after church authorities banned such idolatrous practices. The miners' spirituality also left marks on mainstream Christianity. The now universal tradition of Christmas lights may owe something to miners' Advent practices. Their custom of illuminating windows during winter's darkest weeks spread from mining regions to general populations. Even St. Barbara's current status as patron saint of artillerymen reflects how mining metaphors permeated military culture during the gunpowder era. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of this faith is its testament to human resilience. Faced with unimaginable daily dangers, medieval miners didn't abandon spirituality. They reinvented it, blending traditions to create meaning where none was readily apparent. Their chapels may have been crude, their theology unorthodox, but their determination to find transcendence in the deepest darkness remains one of history's most moving examples of the indomitable human spirit. The slow collapse of medieval mining communities unfolded not with dramatic explosions, but through the quiet erosion of hope. generations grinding themselves to dust until nothing remained but ghost towns and fragmented memories. This decline followed predictable patterns across Europe, leaving behind physical and psychological scars that would endure for centuries after the last miner descended into the pits. The first death knell came when veins played out. Unlike modern geologists, medieval miners had no way to predict or deposit's true extent. A thriving community could vanish almost overnight when a supposedly inexhaustible silver seam abruptly ended. Edmund witnessed this in his own lifetime. The Derbyshire mine that had sustained his village for 3 generations suddenly yielding nothing but worthless rock by his 50th year. Within months, the more fortunate families packed their meager belongings onto carts. The destitute simply walked away from company cottages they could no longer pay rent on, leaving behind broken tools and unpaid debts. Technological obsolescence destroyed other communities. When Hungarian miners developed more efficient drainage techniques in the 1380s, English tin mines relying on outdated bucket chains became uncompetitive almost immediately. Towns that had flourished for centuries found their or suddenly too expensive to extract, their workers too set in old methods to adapt. The psychological impact was profound. Entire generations who had defined themselves by their mining skills became obsolete overnight, left to wander as itinerant laborers or starve in place. Market shifts could be equally devastating. The discovery of massive silver deposits in Bohemia around 1300 collapsed prices across Europe, making hundreds of small mines economically unviable. For communities like Edmund's, this meant that even when or remained, it no longer paid to extract it. The cruelest twist came when mine owners, rather than losing money operating marginally productive pits, simply locked the gates and walked away, leaving workers without even the meager wages they depended on. War and politics finished off many remaining operations. When Edward III confiscated Cornish tin revenues to fund his French campaigns in the 1340s, local miners found their already meager pay have to fill royal coffers. Similar confiscations occurred whenever kings needed quick funds. The very wealth miners bled to extract being used to buy the swords that would spill more blood elsewhere. Some communities resisted. Most simply dissolved as families fled conscription or taxation. Environmental degradation accelerated the decline. Areas that had been mined for centuries eventually became so polluted they couldn't support life at all. The once verdant valleys around German silver mines turned into barren wastelands where even weeds struggled to grow. Rivers ran thick with mining waste, their waters poisoning downstream communities long after the mines themselves had closed. These ecological dead zones became medieval no-man's lands, places where only the desperate or outcast would dwell. The human costs of this collapse were immeasurable. Mining skills didn't transfer to other professions. A master hewer's knowledge of rock fractures was useless in farming or carpentry. Displaced miners often formed wandering bands of beggars, their distinctive hunched postures and blackened fingernails marking them as outcasts. Some turned to crime, using their underground expertise to become tunnel-digging burglars or smugglers. A few found work in the emerging gunpowder industry, their experience with explosives being one of the few transferable skills from mining. Women and children suffered disproportionately in the decline. Widows who had depended on company housing found themselves literally thrown into the streets when mines closed. Many resorted to prostitution near army camps or larger towns, their mining village backgrounds making them unmarriageable in agricultural communities. Children who had spent their formative years underground were particularly ill-equipped to adapt. Many teenage trappers couldn't even tolerate sunlight after years in darkness, their ruined eyesight condemning them to beggary. The physical remnants of these communities tell poignant stories. Abandoned mines still bear the last shift marks, tools left leaning against walls as if awaiting their owner's return, candles burned down to stubs on makeshift altars. Company stores stand frozen in time, their shelves still holding jars of spoiled food no one could afford to take. Most haunting are the personal items: a child's doll carved from mined timber, a wedding ring fashioned from scrap silver, a Bible with generations of births and deaths recorded until the entries stop abruptly. Psychological scars ran even deeper. Surviving records from mining parishes show sudden spikes in melancholia deaths following closures. Men and women literally dying of broken hearts. Folk songs from former mining regions are filled with imagery of darkness and loss, their minor key melodies sounding nothing like the cheerful tunes of agricultural communities. Even the language preserved traces of trauma. Mining terms like played out and empty vein entered local dialects as metaphors for hopelessness. Yet from this devastation emerged unexpected resilience. Some communities reinvented themselves around secondary industries, charcoal burning in deforested areas, or quarrying stone from played-out mines. A few particularly resourceful villages turned their toxic landscapes into sources of strange beauty, the brilliant blue-green runoff from copper mines becoming prized pigments for artists. Others capitalized on their hard-won knowledge, with former miners becoming sought-after consultants for new operations elsewhere. The church struggled to respond to this collapse. Monasteries that had invested heavily in mining saw their revenues vanish overnight, forcing austerity measures that sometimes included abandoning scriptoria and libraries. Parish priests in mining regions reported crisis of faith among their flocks. If God had allowed such suffering, how could he be benevolent? Some responded with innovative theologies emphasizing redemptive suffering. Others simply drank themselves into oblivion along with their parishioners. Modern archaeology reveals how thoroughly some communities tried to erase their mining pasts. Villages that transitioned successfully to farming often buried or burned evidence of their industrial origins. Ash layers containing mining tools and/or fragments testify to deliberate acts of forgetting. Oral traditions were sanitized, with stories emphasizing bucolic roots while omitting centuries of underground labor. Only in isolated regions where mining continued into later eras did the old knowledge survive intact. The legacy of these collapsed communities lives on in unexpected ways. Contemporary labor movements unconsciously echo medieval miners' struggles. The fight for severance pay mirroring demands for play-out compensation, found in 14th century petitions. Environmental remediation techniques, first developed to heal mining scars, became prototypes for modern pollution cleanup. Even our concept of industrial decline as social catastrophe stems from these medieval precedents. Perhaps most profoundly, the ghost mining towns stand as mute witnesses to capitalism's cyclical brutality. When we today see Appalachian coal communities dying or Rust Belt factories closing, we're observing the latest iterations of a pattern established when Edmund's generation watched their world evaporate. The specifics change, silver veins then, coal seems now, but the human toll remains devastatingly familiar. In the end, what survived wasn't the mines or the companies, but the stubborn human capacity to endure. The children and grandchildren of miners carried forward not just trauma, but hard-won wisdom about solidarity and survival. Their descendants would unionize factories, fight for safety regulations, and demand fair wages, not knowing they walked paths first cleared by medieval ancestors who suffered so future generations might labor with slightly more dignity. The mines themselves are gone, but their lessons, written in blood, soot, and tears, remain. The legacy of medieval mining extends far beyond the collapsed tunnels and abandoned villages, its echoes reverberating through modern labor movements, environmental policies, and even our fundamental understanding of workers' rights. What began as a brutal struggle for survival in the 14th century has evolved into foundational principles that continue shaping how we balance human welfare against industrial progress today. The most direct inheritance lies in occupational safety standards. Modern mining regulations, from mandatory ventilation systems to emergency oxygen tanks, are direct responses to medieval catastrophes. When today's engineers calculate load-bearing ratios for tunnel supports, they're applying mathematical solutions to problems that killed countless Edmonds. The very concept of shift rotations originated from medieval observations that miners working shorter underground periods suffered fewer health complications. Even something as mundane as hard hats descend from the leather caps. Some innovative miners began lining with metal strips after noticing head injuries were survivable when tools glanced off reinforced surfaces. Labor organization traces equally deep roots to mining communities. The first recorded strikes occurred in 13th century German silver mines, where workers collectively refused to enter flooded shafts until drainage improved. Medieval miners developed sophisticated systems of mutual aid, sick funds financed by percentage deductions from wages, burial cooperatives ensuring dignified funerals, and even early versions of workers' compensation where injured miners received portions of comrades' earnings. These informal networks planted seeds for formal unions, with the 15th century Cornish Tin Workers Guild becoming one of history's first labor organizations to negotiate contracts. Environmental protection laws also bear mining's dark imprint. The 1388 English Statute of Foreshores, often cited as the first environmental legislation, specifically prohibited mine waste dumping in rivers after downstream villages petitioned Parliament about poisoned fisheries. Similar ordinances appeared across Europe, creating precedents for the precautionary principle, now central to ecological regulation. Modern remediation techniques for acid mine drainage still build upon medieval observations that certain plants, like the metallophyte grasses Edmund noticed, could extract toxins from soil. The psychological toll of mining labor spawned unexpected advancements. What medieval physicians dismissed as miners' melancholy is now recognized as a textbook manifestation of chronic workplace trauma, the first documented cases of what we term PTSD in industrial settings. Modern studies of isolated work environments, like oil rigs or Arctic stations, still reference medieval miners' coping mechanisms, from structured rituals to controlled dark humor. Even the concept of hazard pay originates from 14th century mining contracts where deep-level workers received marginally higher wages, not enough to compensate risk, but establishing the principle that danger should impact compensation. Technological evolution carries medieval fingerprints. The transition from pickaxes to mechanical drills didn't eliminate silicosis, it just changed the particle size. Today's debates over automation's impact mirror medieval tensions when water pumps began replacing bucket brigades. The hydraulic fracturing techniques revolutionizing modern energy extraction descend directly from medieval fire-setting methods, complete with the same debates about groundwater contamination. Every advancement carries its own new dangers, proving the essential truth medieval miners understood. No technology eliminates risk, only redistributes it. Social welfare systems owe surprising debts to mining's horrors. Germany's pioneering health insurance schemes in the 1880s drew heavily on medieval miners' guild practices. The British welfare state's emphasis on workplace injury compensation stems from 19th century reforms inspired by historical accounts of mining disasters. Even modern disability classifications for respiratory diseases use medieval miners' symptoms as baseline markers. The progression from miner's cough to cyanosis remains a diagnostic standard for pneumoconiosis. The cultural impact is equally profound. Mining's imagery permeates our language. Canary in a coal mine, dark as a pit, shafted, all originate from medieval practices. Literary tropes of underground journeys, from Dante's Inferno to modern horror films, inevitably borrow from miners' descriptions of subterranean terrors. The very concept of alienation in Marxist theory builds upon medieval philosophers' observations about miners' psychological detachment from surface society. Medical research continues benefiting from these ancient sacrifices. Contemporary studies using medieval miners' remains have revealed startling data about heavy metal accumulation rates. Findings now apply to radiation exposure models. The Bristol Miners Study, tracking descendants of 14th century workers, provided the first evidence of epigenetic trauma transmission across generations. Even COVID-19 ventilation protocols borrowed from medieval mining engineers' understanding of airflow in confined spaces. Yet for all this progress, fundamental injustices persist. Modern artisanal miners in Congo or Bolivia face conditions strikingly similar to Edmund's. child labor, preventable accidents, environmental ruin. The supply chains powering our smartphones and electric vehicles still originate in hellscapes medieval miners would recognize instantly. Our consumption continues driving cycles of exploitation that technological tweaks fail to break. Perhaps the most poignant legacy is the miner's ultimate lesson, that human dignity must never be sacrificed to industrial efficiency. When we see contemporary warehouse workers denied bathroom breaks or gig laborers risking lives for algorithms, we're witnessing the same dehumanization that killed medieval miners. The difference is we now have alternatives, safety regulations, labor laws, environmental protections, all forged in the fires of mining's cruel history. The true memorial to Edmund and his comrades isn't found in museums or history books, but in every workplace safety inspection, every environmental impact study, every union contract. Their suffering wrote the first chapters in humanity's ongoing struggle to reconcile production with humanity, a story whose concluding pages we're still writing today. As we harness new technologies from nanotech to asteroid mining, their experiences remind us that progress without justice isn't advancement, just the same old exploitation wearing a spacesuit.